Well, good afternoon to everyone. It is 2 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started with the applicant briefing for Tropical Storm Helene. A few housekeeping items just up front. One, we are recording this applicant briefing to potentially be posted on our website. So just want to make sure everyone's aware of that. The chat will be monitored by some staff members as we are going through, but we will be answering most questions to the end of the presentation. If you have a question throughout, please just put it in the chat and we'll make sure we touch on it as a group at the end. All questions will be answered in the chat just in case anyone else has the same question. With that, my name is Thomas Bennett. I'm the Eastern Branch Supervisor here with Public Assistance, and I'm going to turn it over to Janine Stevenson, who is our Central Branch Supervisor. Janine?
Thanks, Thomas. If you will give me a thumbs up if you can hear me, I just want to make sure my volume is good.
You're all good, Janine.
Thank you. So again, as Thomas mentioned, this is the public assistance briefing for Tropical Storm Helene. Here are the event details. The declaration for Tropical Storm Helene is DR 4827-NC. The declaration date is September 28th, 2024. The incident period began September 25th, 2024, and is still ongoing. The RPA deadline is to be determined, but we encourage you to submit your request for public assistance as soon as possible, and we'll talk more about this in a few slides. Finally, declared categories of work include categories A through G, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and Category Z, which we will also review in a little bit. Counties under the current major disaster declaration include Alexander, Allegheny, Ashe, Avery, Buncombe, Burke, Caldwell, Catawba, Clay, Cleveland, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, Gaston, Haywood, Henderson, Jackson, Lincoln, Macon, Madison, McDowell, Mitchell, Polk, Rutherford, Transylvania, Watauga, Wilkes, and Yancey. Mecklenburg and Swain are only eligible for categories A and B, which we will review later on. More counties are continuing to be added. So for today's agenda, we will be addressing the Public Assistance Program, 3 steps to request reimbursement for all categories of public assistance taken during Tropical Storm Helene, procurement procedures brought to us by FEMA, contracts, and resources. First, we will begin by reviewing the Public Assistance Program and the application process related to Tropical Storm Helene. The Public Assistance Program provides grants to eligible states, territories, tribes, local governments, and eligible private nonprofits to assist with the reimbursement of response and recovery from events. The Public Assistance Program is governed by the laws of the Stafford Act. 44 CFR addresses program regulations. 2 CFR addresses procurement, and the Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide, also known as the Papa G. There are 3 easy steps to start the FEMA reimbursement process. We will go through these steps in the upcoming slides. Keep in mind that as applicants, you are applying for a grant from FEMA to reimburse eligible expenses. The first step is to register in FEMA's grants portal. Grants portal is the primary access point between FEMA, you as the applicant, and the state. The applicant has the ability to define and assign roles for all personnel that will participate in the reimbursement process. Submit your request for public assistance, upload documentation to support your reimbursement requests, and much more. All documentation requests from FEMA will come through Grants Portal. All applicants seeking reimbursement for costs related to public assistance during Tropical Storm Helene should submit a request for public assistance, or RPA, through FEMA's Grants Portal. If you're not sure whether your organization qualifies, submit an RPA anyway. This is a sample list, in no way all-inclusive, of public entities and private nonprofits that may be eligible for FEMA reimbursement. You may notice that departments such as police and fire are not listed. Individual departments will submit for reimbursement through their unit of government. For example, the Office of the Sheriff is included under the county's reimbursement request. Keep in mind the reimbursement process from FEMA cannot start until the request for public assistance is submitted and approved. The RPA is submitted through Grants Portal. The deadline to submit an RPA is 30 days after the declaration date or 30 days after the incident period closes. For Tropical Storm Helene, RPAs can continue to be submitted. If your organization is already registered in Grants Portal, you have received reimbursement for past disasters, or submitted an RPA, please confirm your login and contact information, as well as that for personnel that will be assisting with the reimbursement process. If you are not familiar with your public assistance grants manager, please email us at pahotline@ncdps.gov. This email address can be your one-stop shop for assistance with Grants Portal, EM grants, and any other questions regarding this process. Make sure that your documentation is up to date in Grants Portal. If you are not registered in Grants Portal, visit grantee.fema.gov and select Register Your Organization for Public Assistance. Make sure you have the registration documents needed before beginning the RPA process. Applicants will need their organization name and type, EIN, and UEI number. If you do not have a UEI number, please visit sam.gov. You will also need it to register in the state's portal once your RPA is approved. Private nonprofits must submit the information listed during the registration process in Grants Portal. Required documentation may include tax-exempt certification, proof of ownership or legal responsibility, proof of insurance, and corporate documents. If you are a private educational organization, you will also need to submit accreditation information. This documentation is not required for public entities that were mentioned earlier. The second step in the FEMA reimbursement process is to register in EM grants. Without registering in EM grants, the state is unable to release any funding. EM grants is the state portal, a conduit between the state and applicant. It will be the platform where reimbursement documentation is submitted and the closeout process will be completed. It is important to complete the funding agreement, the state applicant agreement, or SAA, the designation of applicant's agent and assurances, also known as the DAA, as well as submit an updated W-9. Without this documentation, applicants may jeopardize their funding. It is very important that a new W-9 is required for every event. If you have already registered in EM grants, please make sure, again, that your contact information and supporting personnel information is up to date. You will also need to complete a funding agreement, which we will go over in the next few slides. If you have not registered in EM grants previously, visit emgrants.gov www.nc.gov and go to register. When registering for EM grants, make sure you have a valid email address, phone number, applicant organization, and under the program, select PA or public assistance. If you have any issues or concerns, please email us at pahotline@ncdps.gov. Your next steps is to complete a funding agreement. The funding agreement workflow is under Accounts on the left side of your screen or in the top bar on the menu. I won't go over each individual step of the funding agreement process. However, if you need additional help, feel free to review the tutorials on the webpage, contact us at pahotline@ncdps.gov, or reach out to your PA grants manager directly. The information in the funding agreement generates the DAA and SAA mentioned earlier. Once that documentation is completed, you can download copies of each of these documents for your records. It is also important to retain your records for 3 to 5 years after the disaster is closed by the state. A few additional things of note are audit requirements. The Single Audit Act and 2 CFR Part 200.501 require an annual audit of non-federal entities, including tribes, that expend $750,000 or more of federal financial assistance in a fiscal year. North Carolina state law requires units of local government, and public authorities have their accounts audited each fiscal year and submit a copy of the audit report to the Secretary of the Local Government Commission. This means your auditor must conduct a single audit during the fiscal year, and that audit can be requested by the state as part of your reimbursement process. If you have questions about your requirements, please contact your local auditor. So to recap, the first step in the FEMA reimbursement process is to submit a request for public assistance in Grants Portal. The second step is to complete the funding agreement and upload an updated W-9 in the state's portal, EM Grants. If you have questions, please contact us at pahotline@ncdps.gov or reach out to your PA grants manager. I will now turn it over to Thomas Bennett, Eastern Branch Supervisor, to review step 3 in the process, how to document your expenses.
Thank you, Janine. As she just mentioned, we're now going to cover documentation requirements as well as just the different categories of work within the public assistance program. Our declaration for Tropical Storm Helene includes reimbursement for emergency and permanent work. We will discuss the categories of work over the coming slides. FEMA will determine eligibility using the pyramid to the right. To be an eligible cost, you must be an eligible applicant, such as a state or local government or critical private nonprofit. You must have legal responsibility for the costs being incurred, be within one of the declared counties mentioned earlier, and those costs must be a direct result of Tropical Storm Helene. Additionally, costs must be reasonable and necessary as determined by FEMA. As we begin the recovery process throughout the state, please continue to document all damages incurred due to Tropical Storm Helene. As we receive updates from FEMA with new guidance on our current declaration, we will ensure to push that out to everybody. Please continue to monitor the public assistance website for updates or reach out to your grants manager whenever you wish. Categories A and B constitute emergency work, and that is work that is done immediately upon the arrival of the incident. Please note, for Tropical Storm Helene, FEMA will reimburse emergency work, categories A and B, at 100% with no non-federal share for the first 6 months. Category A is debris removal. And debris removal includes debris in the right of way, picked up and moved to a debris management site or landfill to be disposed of in any sort of way, such as grinding or burning. Regular and overtime force account labor is eligible for reimbursement. Please ensure you listen for the term cradle to grave when discussing your debris projects with FEMA as well as any debris contractors. We must have documentation that establishes where the debris came from, any temporary sites, including the permits for those temporary sites if possible, as well as where the final resting place to be eligible for public assistance. Category B is emergency protective measures. And emergency protective measures can include sheltering, evacuations, pre-positioning equipment, and others. And those measures taken pre, during, and post-incident. Applicants have 6 months to complete all emergency work, but can receive an extension of up to another 6 months. Additional time extensions must go to FEMA with a letter of support from the state. I would now welcome James Barker, our Public Assistance Section Manager, for some more information about debris in this incident.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thomas, can y'all hear me?
Yes, sir.
All right. So some additional information about debris, especially as it pertains to this event. There are 4 options that entities will have to facilitate the removal of debris. There is force account labor, locally procured contracts, state preposition contracts, and Army Corps of Engineers. The state is not going to tell entities which route to take. That is solely up to y'all as a local entities to decide how and what would best suit you. There is a memorandum of agreement that has been rapidly pushed out for NCDOT and local entities. So if local entities are going to pick up debris on DOT roads, okay, let me see if I can get this. How's my sound now?
Sounds fine to me, sir.
All right. So if local entities would like to, excuse me. If local entities have, Thomas, go ahead and continue on with your discussions. I'll get this on
Yes, sir.
the back.
Yes, sir. Yeah, apologies for the background noise, everybody. He's in the middle of the EOC, so there's a lot flying around, as you can imagine. What he was getting at is there is an MOU between the NC Department of Transportation and local governments to pick up debris on NCDOT roads if there is an immediate emergency need to clear those roads. So you would be covered for that. I would just ask if you are encountering that, at least make your grants manager aware or reach out to James Barker, whose email is at the end of this presentation, just to make sure that we're all covered. The other major category of work is permanent work. Permanent work consists of 5 major categories. That is category C, roads and bridges. These are road systems in North Carolina, and those, as we were just talking about, include federal, state, and local roads. Private roads are generally not eligible, and if roads are maintained by NCDOT, NCDOT can claim the damages to those roads. Again, that is separate from any incidences where you need to use the MOU for any debris clearing in an emergency situation on a DOT road. The next category is category D. That's water control facilities. And these facilities are built for purposes that include land reclamation, irrigation, drainage, and stormwater management. Category E is our buildings and equipment. Buildings include county and local buildings, their contents, equipment, and furnishings. And that equipment can also include vehicles and construction equipment. FEMA has a schedule of equipment rates available for that equipment, and that includes maintenance, fuel, and hourly usage rates. We would ask if you are claiming any vehicles or equipment within that schedule of rates. We do not double submit any fuel or maintenance costs that are associated with that. Those costs are already baked in to the rate that's on the schedule. Category F, it covers utilities, and that can include water storage facilities, natural gas transmission, sewage treatment facilities, and communication systems. And finally, category G is parks, recreation, and other facilities that can include parks, zoos, mass transit facilities, and really any other facility that doesn't neatly fit into one of the above categories. Please keep in mind that all of these facilities need to be owned and maintained by the local government entity. Like emergency work, there are extension options should work take longer than the prescribed 18 months from the declaration date. The state can grant an additional 30 months, after which we do need to go to FEMA for their approval. All of those extension requests, both for emergency work and permanent work, should go through EM grants. FEMA requires compliance with all environmental and historic preservation for all projects, no matter if they are an improved project, alternate, or your general pre-disaster condition projects. Linked here, and again, this will be posted on the website. There is the EHP green sheet that has contacts, frequently asked questions, necessary required documentation so that you can comply with all federal, state, and local laws. When documenting all expenses for this event, details are going to be the most important factor for getting reimbursement. We provided some examples here of necessary details, but please don't feel limited to that list. Whatever additional information you can provide will greatly improve the speed of your project's obligation and eventual reimbursement. If you would like assistance with tracking your costs, FEMA has provided worksheets for all cost types reimbursable within the Public Assistance Program. To access them, you'll log into Grants Portal and click the question mark icon in the upper right-hand corner shown here. In the resources library, all of these helpful worksheets can be found in the forms section. Please note these forms are not required for public assistance. They're only here to provide assistance should you need it. If you have a better in-house form of tracking these costs that can meet the necessary detail requirements, you are absolutely allowed to use those. That is fine. There are 5 main cost types that are reimbursable under FEMA public assistance, each with different eligibility and documentation requirements. We'll start with force account labor. These are your in-house employees performing eligible work. Any overtime claims are based on your personnel policy at the time of the event, so please provide a copy when you submit any costs. Temporary employees hired for disaster are eligible as force account labor, and only these employees are eligible for both regular and overtime in a Cat B situation. Next, we'll talk about force account equipment. These are costs incurred for equipment owned by you, the applicant. These are generators, law enforcement vehicles, chainsaws, the list goes on and on. Again, this declaration is going to utilize the 2023 FEMA schedule of equipment rates, and those rates include fuel and maintenance costs. Please do not double submit costs as fuel separate from your equipment costs when you're submitting to FEMA. For materials, these can either be from your own inventory or purchased. Documentation will be needed. It'll be dependent on the source. So please ensure you're keeping all invoices, receipts, any inventory control registers, maintenance records for the duration of the time that you work the event and participate in public assistance for Tropical Storm Helene. Next is contract work, which generally constitutes the bulk of disaster response. Please ensure that you document your procurement process for all contracts during this event. FEMA has joined us for the call, and they have a section later in this presentation that goes more in depth on general procurement requirements and do's and don'ts. Please provide your local procurement policy in Grants Portal. Temporary employees, again, are not contractors, and they should be claimed as force account labor. Please ensure you are utilizing the North Carolina Electronic Vendor Portal and SAM.gov to check for debarred contractors. Federal funding cannot be used for work performed by debarred contractors. Finally, rental equipment. For any equipment you need to rent from an outside source, we will need your rental agreement. Often, when not provided as a separate document, the invoice you receive functions as your rental agreement. So please ensure that you're turning those in as you're claiming those costs. Please retain your receipts to validate the rental equipment costs, And for rental equipment, fueling costs are eligible as per the rental agreement. If you are unsure about a cost type, continue to document your expenses in as much detail as possible. FEMA or NCEM public assistance staff will assist you once you're registered in Grants Portal. All applicants will be eligible for a Category Z management cost project in addition to your documented damages resulting from Tropical Storm Helene. These projects are created at the end of your project submission process and are based on 5% of your total eligible costs. These projects require a final inspection as they are 100% federally funded and are based on actual costs capped at the 5% written amount. For example, if you have management cost project written for $10,000, but you turn in actual costs of $8,000, we'll be able to claim that $8,000, but the remaining $2,000 will need to be deobligated. On the other side of that, if you have a $10,000 project and you submit costs of $15,000, we're limited to only claiming the $10,000 since the projects are capped at the original written amount. Management costs are any indirect costs and administrative expenses that are reasonably incurred associated with managing the grant. These include but are not limited to things like conducting preliminary damage assessments, correspondence with FEMA and the state, as well as any meeting you have with FEMA and the state, and any grant management activities that you will need to perform as we live the life of the grant, such as quarterly reporting, closeouts, any extension or scope changes, and reimbursement requests. A project is a grouping of related eligible expenses, the description of work associated and cost estimated for any work to be completed, and the approved scope from FEMA. This is one of the first disasters in North Carolina that's going to be entirely under FEMA's new project threshold. So I wanted to take some time and make sure those were clear and discuss the challenges that may face as a result of that. For Tropical Storm Helene, the minimum project amount is $3,900. If your total costs do not exceed that amount, we will not be able to provide public assistance funding. Small projects are anything less than $1,037,000. Small project funding is fixed and is paid as obligated, whether written on estimates or on actual costs. If you are creating projects based on estimates, it is imperative that your estimates be as accurate as they possibly can be. This is just due to the difficulty of obtaining additional funding should your actual costs rise above your obligated costs. The only ways to gain additional funding on small projects is either through verification of actual insurance proceeds or a small project netting, which is an audit of all small projects once they are completed and a cost adjustment based on the net outcome of all projects. Both of these options can result in a reduction of funding. We strongly encourage you to diligently document all costs associated with your small projects as they are incurred so we can request additional funding if necessary. Large projects are anything over $1,037,001. All large projects will be offered as a fixed cost offer, so if you do not want to utilize that program, you will need to decline this option in Grants Portal. All reimbursement and grant monitoring requirements will occur in EM grants. Closeout will be required to be submitted no later than 90 days after work completion date, and the closeout process operates in both Grants Portal and EM grants. FEMA is a funding source of last resort, and they will not reimburse costs that have been or could be funded by an external source. Please document all your expenses, not just those being submitted to FEMA, in order to verify duplication questions should FEMA or the state ask. If you have items being funded by multiple sources, including FEMA, please ensure we can effectively separate all costs to their appropriate sources upon closeout. I would now welcome our FEMA representative to discuss procurement requirements and common pitfalls. Flor, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Flor Manzanares. I'm a program specialist with the Procurement Disaster Assistance Team, often referred to as PDAT. So a little bit about the team. We're a small team out of headquarters that really focus on procurement under grants. So those rules that are triggered whenever you are procuring under a federal award or under your FEMA award. So today we're just really going to be focused on some key areas where we have seen higher levels of noncompliance so that we can, make sure that everybody's aware of those areas so we can avoid falling into those pitfalls as we go through response recovery. So next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. All right, so first and foremost, we're going to really talk about why we're here, right? Why is this important? The reason is noncompliance is pretty costly. So if we take a look at the Office of Inspector General's audits from 2012 through 2021, we'll see that they did find over $660 million of potentially ineligible contract costs due to noncompliance with the procurement requirements. So, and unfortunately, in a lot of those circumstances, they do recommend disallowance of costs, and remedies could be applied by the grant program. So that's why we're here. That's why we're talking about these rules, so that as North Carolina goes through response recovery efforts, as you enter into these contracts, you are aware of these responsibilities, these requirements, whenever you are purchasing under that FEMA award. Next slide. All right, so these rules did go through some updates recently. So the Office of Management and Budget did release updates that came into effect on October 1st of this year. And FEMA is working to see, make sure, or with that possibility of these disaster declarations under Tropical Storm Helene, that they would all follow the October 1st rules. And so we will have more guidance and information forthcoming in the next few days and possibly into next week. But for the purpose of this slide deck, for this training, we're really going to be focused on these new rules and really focus on those areas where there is that potential of noncompliance and following these new rules that came into effect on October 1st of this year. So if we can go ahead and go into the next slide. All right, so when we talk about these rules, what exactly are we talking about? Well, we're really focused on the rules in 2 CFR subsections 200.317 through 327. So these are going to be the 11 rules that govern procurement under grants. If you are interested in taking a look at these in the original format, you can definitely do so on ecfr.gov. We'll go ahead and pop that link into the chat so you can take a look at it. Now, these 11 rules were put in place to mainly make sure costs are reasonable. But however, there are other policy goals as well. But for the most part, these are the 11 rules that govern procurement under grants. Not all of them are going to be applicable in all circumstances. There's a few variables to keep in mind, such as your entity type, as well as the facts and circumstances of your procurement. Can we go to the next slide? So one of those variables is definitely going to be your entity type. So the rules do apply differently whether you are a state or Indian tribe and whether you are a local government or a private nonprofit. So we're really going to focus firstly on the rules that apply to state and Indian tribes. This is going to be one of the major changes that came about with these October 1st updates. So tribes are also following the rules applicable to states this time around. So kind of to take a look at what's defined as a state under these rules, it's really going to be any of the 50 states. So North Carolina would be considered a state entity, as well as DC, any U.S. territories, and as well as any agencies. So, and any state instrumentalities. So any, institutions or hospitals that North Carolina has deemed instrumentalities under their state law would be considered a state entity and would follow the rules applicable to state entities. Tribes would also would be considered any Indian tribe, band, nation, or other organized group or community. It's also going to include any Alaska Native villages or regional or village corporations. So the rules that states and Indian tribes are going to be following are pretty straightforward. There's only 5. So first and foremost, they're going to be following Rule 317, which is procurement by states and Indian tribes. What this rule really says is they're following their own rules. So those rules that they follow for their non-federally funded work, that's what they're going to be following for their federally funded work, right? So that's really what 317 is all about. However, they are required to follow 4 additional rules. Although 321 is now highly encouraged. They are highly encouraged to follow the 6 affirmative steps under socioeconomic contracting. Also, 322 related to domestic preferences, that is a requirement. 323 is recovered materials, which is required for state entities, but not for Indian tribes. And then 327 is contract provisions. So this is a requirement that they include certain contract provisions in their federally funded contracts. So there is specific language that must be included for any contracts that they are expecting to pay for using federal funds. Now, if we do a quick summary, we're looking at state and tribes are going to be following their own procurement policies and procedures. However, they do follow those 4 additional rules. And just with the caveat that tribes do not follow recovered materials. Now, if we pull into the rules that are applicable to local governments and nonprofits, when we look at that definition for these, it's really going to be anything that's not considered a state or a tribe. So that's going to include any cities, counties, towns, governments, any town governments, any hospital systems that are not considered state instrumentalities, as well as any privately funded universities or institutions of higher education. Just keep in mind that depending on state law, some may be thought to be or may be categorized as a state instrumentality. So if you are dealing with an institution of higher education and you're not sure, highly recommend that you sit down with a lawyer or look through that categorization before you move forward with those procurements. Now, lastly, it's going to be private nonprofit organizations. So this is going to include your houses of worship or any other private nonprofit organizations. Now, if we take a look at those rules, there is a lot more that they are required to be compliant with. They are going to be following rules 318 through 327. So there is quite a few more rules that they're required to follow. And additional to that, not only are they following these federal rules from 318 through 327, they are also required to follow their own written procurement policies and procedures, as well as any applicable state or tribal law. So if we do a quick summary, we'll see that local governments and nonprofit organizations are required to follow their own written procurement policies and procedures, plus any applicable state or tribal law, plus those federal rules from 318 through 327. Now, quick note on this, there may be times where there's inconsistencies between the 3. So one thing that we'll talk about a little bit later is thresholds, right? So it may be that the federal threshold is much higher than their own local or even their state. So in that case, they should be following the more restrictive in order to remain compliant with all 3 tiers. So can we go to the next slide? Next slide. So we're really going to be focused on some of these areas where we have seen higher levels of non-compliance. So the first one's going to be full and open competition. So generally speaking, any procurements that you're going to be purchasing or using federal funds for, they are required to be in full, with full and open competition in mind. There's great benefits to this, but really it's just making sure that everybody that would like to submit a sealed bidder proposal is able to do so. And just making sure that as you're going through that procurement process, that you are not applying any actions or considering any actions that would be considered restrictive of competition. So some of those things may be, requiring unnecessary experience, using excessive bonding requirements, or even, using contractors that you already have on retainer. All right, so with that, we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you. So another thing is going to be cost or price analysis. So a cost or price analysis is going to be required for any of those procurements that are over $250,000. So independent estimates are going to be required before receiving bids or proposals, and then cost or price are going to be after receiving those bids or proposals. Now, it's not both, right? You don't have to also do a price and a cost analysis. It's really up to that entity to determine which one they want to do, but one or the other is going to be required alongside those independent estimates that they're getting beforehand. Now, these are really going to be tied to those procurements that are going through that full and open competition process. If you are going through a non-competitive procurement that is under emergency or exigent circumstances, right, this might be a little bit more limited. However, cost reasonableness is definitely still going to be important and a common theme throughout all of these rules. So with that, we can go to the next slide. All right, so sole sourcing. So there are 5 exemptions or 5 circumstances in which an entity is able to go ahead and go straight to a contractor. In other words, go through a non-competitive procurement. They are not going through the full and open competition process. They're just going straight to a vendor or a contractor. So it is possible, it is allowed. However, it's only allowed in 5 circumstances. The first one is going to be micro purchases. So if that procurement is under $10,000, then an entity is able to go straight to a contractor or a vendor. And the only requirement is to make sure that those costs are reasonable and, if possible, try to vary on the vendors. However, quick note on this again, that is the federal threshold of $10,000. It may be that your own local or state law may have lower thresholds. So just make sure that that is something that's getting checked before you go ahead and enter into these procurements. The second circumstance in which entities are going to be able to go through a sole source procurement is going to be when it's only available from a single source. So this is really tied to things like intellectual property or, system compatibility. It may be that part of a system, radio system, got lost, and now we're having to replace it. And there's only one brand that is compatible with the system that you have in place. That would be a good circumstance or a good example of having to use that single source availability requirement. Now, the third one, we're going to focus a little bit more on this in the next few slides as well, but exigency or emergency circumstances are definitely going to be one of those areas that we see a lot. And it is going to be one of those areas where you will be able to go directly to a contractor. However, there are some strings attached to that, which we'll talk about briefly in the next few slides. And then number 4 is inadequate competition. Unfortunately, this is something that we do see post-disasters. A lot of times there's contractors that are just not available or are just not submitting sealed bidder proposals. So if an entity is going through that full and open competition process, they can't get enough bids or proposals in. They can go ahead and claim inadequate competition and just go forward with their selected contractor. Now, 5th is going to be awarding agency or pass-through entity approval. We call this the unicorn rule. We never see this happen, so we're just going to go ahead and skip over that one. So next slide. So focusing a little bit more on E&E circumstances. So an entity is allowed to go ahead and enter into a sole source procurement if they're undergoing a public emergency or exigency. Now, though these terms are often used interchangeably, they are technically 2 different things. An emergency is going to be the need to alleviate a threat to life, public health or safety, or improve property. Meanwhile, exigency is going to be tied to other important community needs. So, for example, the need to avoid, prevent, or alleviate serious harm or injury, financial or otherwise. So a good example of this could be something like schools, or maybe there's a sporting event that the area really relies on, that they really need that income, and unfortunately it's getting canceled due to debris or whatever it may be the case. So that would be good examples of exigent circumstances, right? Going back to that school example as well, post-disaster, they need to make sure that that school is up and running so those parents can get back to work, those kids can get back into school, so they can go ahead and claim exigent circumstances and say, hey, we need to get someone in there fast so that we can get these schools ready to go so the kids are back in school. So though that's not a immediate threat to public health or safety, it is a threat to an important community need, so they could claim exigent circumstances. Now, when it comes to this, there are strings attached, like I mentioned before. They are required to have justification and documentation to back that up. I will say oftentimes we'll see something like a statewide emergency declaration from the governor, right? Unfortunately, that's not going to be sufficient. You will have to provide sufficient documentation and justification that says why your specific entity is undergoing that emergency and exigent circumstance. Though that emergency declaration from the governor can be part of that justification, in and of itself is not sufficient to meet that requirement. So if you are interested a little bit more on some suggested elements for justification, we do have a fact sheet called the E&E Circumstances Fact Sheet. Highly recommend. I see Chris popped it into the chat. On page, I believe, 6 or 7 of that fact sheet, you will find some suggested elements. Now, the next 2 are kind of tied together. the entities are only allowed to use that sole source procurement during the period of actual emergency or exigency. What that means is if they deem that the emergency period is 3 weeks long, then they can only use that sole source procurement during those 3 weeks. If they claim that it is 6 months long, they can only use it during those 6 months. The federal rules do not have a set limit or set time as to how long this is going to be. However, it is the responsibility of that entity to determine, of that recipient or subrecipient, to provide justification as to why they believe that the period is 3 months, 4 weeks, right? Or even, 18 weeks, right? They are required to provide that justification as well. Once that period ends, they are going to be required to go ahead and transition into a more competitive method, into a contract with a different that has been competitively bid at that point. So something that we do encourage is as you're going into your procurements, as you're going through your sole source procurement, go ahead and start that process for a competitively bid one. So once that period ends, you are able to transition into that more competitively bid contract. So you can go ahead and go to the next one. So one thing that we do see is pre-awarded or pre-position contracts. These are great. However, unfortunately, sometimes they don't exactly meet the need that we need at present. So for example, let's say you had a pre-position contract for debris removal and you had a ceiling price of $1 million on that. Unfortunately, post-tropical storm Helene, you're now looking at something that's closer to 5 million or maybe 10 million. And you're like, well, can I use that pre-position contract? So although that would be a vast increase in that scope of work, you would still be able to use that contract if you can claim emergency and exigent circumstances. If you meet the requirements for emergency and exigent circumstances, are able to provide that justification, are able to, have that justification for that period of emergency and exigency, and are able to abide by all the different requirements under E&E, you could go ahead and use that pre-existing contract. Just again, keep in mind that it would be considered a non-competitive procurement, and you would have to follow all those requirements under E&E. All right, so there are two contract types that are considered very high risk, and the rules do have some additional requirements in place for those. So the first one's going to be a T&M, or a time and materials contract. So we see these a lot post-disaster, dealing with debris. And so entities are able to go ahead and use a T&M contract. So local governments and PNPs are able to use T&M contracts. However, there are, again, some limitations, right? First and foremost, they're only allowed to use it during that period where they don't have that definite scope of work, where they don't know or can't initially estimate the extent or duration of the work. And then second, they can only use it after determining that no other contract type is suitable. So again, we see this a lot for debris removal post-disaster. Now, again, not only are they required to make sure that they meet that applicability, they also need to make sure that they are including a ceiling price within that contract, and that they're maintaining that high degree of oversight, right? Unfortunately, this is one of those contract types that does give contractors a little bit more of an incentive to increase those performance costs. So that is going to be a requirement that's tied to T&M contracts. And lastly, an entity is only going to be able to, recipient or subrecipient, is only going to be able to use this contract, this T&M contract, until that scope of work becomes clear. Once they're able to estimate how much debris is left, how much work is going to be involved, they are going to be required to go ahead and transition into a different contract type with a different pricing structure. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So the second contract type that is considered highly risky is going to be the cost plus a percentage of cost contract, or a CPPC contract. This is a contract that is prohibited for local governments and private nonprofit organizations. State entities are able to enter into these. However, we highly discourage it because there's a high likelihood of them to fall into to deal with unreasonable costs, because there's just a strong incentive under CPPC contracts for those contractors to increase their performance costs, because as they do that, their profit also increases. So again, for local governments and for And for private nonprofit organizations, this contract type is prohibited. They are not allowed to enter into them. So if you are getting ready to enter into some contracts, I will say sometimes it gets snuck in there, right? There's little elements that may get, put into a contract. So if you're reading through a contract and you see something like 20%, so equipment rental plus 20%, or maybe materials plus 5%, right? That should kind of throw up a red flag. Maybe take a look at that contract a little bit closer. And maybe sit down and try and figure out another way, another contract or pricing structure that lets you know what that profit is before you enter into that contract. So again, 100% prohibited for nonprofit organizations and local governments, and highly discouraged for state entities as well as tribal governments. So you can go ahead and go into the next slide. All right, so number 7 is going to be related to contract provisions. So this is something that is applicable to all recipients and subrecipients of FEMA awards. They are required to include certain contract provisions in their federally funded contracts. So we do have a really excellent guide called the Contract Provisions Guide. Highly recommend if you're going to be entering into any contracts that you pop that in. I will say this is probably the most common, maybe not most common, but definitely one of the common mistakes that we see, and it's something that is preventable, right? So if we can go ahead and take a look at this contract provisions guide as you're putting together that contract or as you're reviewing them, you'll be able to capture and include those required contract provisions, because at the moment, under the new rules, I believe there's 14. Not all of them are applicable in all circumstances. There's a lot of variables related to grant programs, right? Some are not applicable to PA. Others are. Some are only for over $100,000. Some are just for construction work. So there's so many variables in there that it's best to just go ahead and use a good guide like the Contract Provisions Guide to really help you and make sure that you are remaining compliant with Rule 327. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and go into the next slide. All right, so this is going to be very key. Entities are only allowed to enter into contracts with contractors who are deemed responsible. They cannot enter into a contract with contractors who are listed as suspended or debarred on the Systems for Awards Management or SAM.gov. So first and foremost, as soon as you've selected your contractor, pop them into that database on SAM.gov. If they come up as suspended or debarred, unfortunately, that is not going to be allowed. If you do go ahead and enter into a contract with them, you would be putting your FEMA reimbursement at risk, and it would be considered non-compliant. So definitely make sure that you're popping that name into that SAM.gov and you're making a record that you've done that. But don't stop there, right? Continue on, do that due diligence, make sure that you're calling up their past projects, making sure that they were able to live up to that contract, that they were compliant with that public policy. They had the means to actually complete the work that they promised that they would do, and they did it with those materials that they promised they would. So definitely make sure that you are doing that due diligence to ensure that the contractor that has been selected is considered responsible. And something that Thomas was really great about, and everybody else on this call has been really good about, is about saying documentation, right? Talking about record keeping. You want to make sure that you've made a record of going on SAM.gov and popping that into that procurement history. Now, quick note on this, if you pop that contractor's name into SAM.gov and it comes up as, they don't come up at all, right? They're not listed, that's totally okay. Just make sure that you make a copy of that, either a screenshot, print that out, or save that digitally somewhere in that procurement history, just to prove that, hey, I did take this step, I did check SAM.gov, and they just simply weren't listed. So if they're not listed, that's totally okay. Just make sure that you still take that step and make a record of that. Next step. Next slide, please. All right, so just again, very briefly, make sure that you're keeping a record of every step and every move that you're making during your procurement. And just quick note, you are required on the federal level, you are required to keep these for up to 3 years past the submission of the final expenditure report. The state may have higher requirements as well as your local policies and procedures. So I would just make sure that you're keeping track of that and complying with those record keeping requirements. Next slide. Next slide. So unfortunately, fraud can occur. So if you are going through that procurement and you see some suspicious activity or a possibility of fraud, definitely reach out to us using any of these for contact links or phone numbers. So next slide. Now, PDAT has a lot of really excellent resources that really help break down these federal requirements and make it a little bit easier to understand and assimilate. So one of those things, like I mentioned, was that contract provisions guide. We also have a field manual that does kind of go through all of those requirements, as well as, we do have certain fact sheets like that E&E fact sheet that I mentioned earlier that talks about, what are those steps that you're required to take? What are those kind of strings attached whenever you are claiming emergency and exigent circumstances? Now, I will note that a lot of our resources, some of them have been updated, others are incoming in regards to these upcoming rules or these new rules. However, for the most part, for example, the E&E fact sheet is still going to be relevant. And we also are providing, if you want to reach out to us, you can reach out to us at FEMA-grants-news, fema.dhs.gov if you have any additional questions. But we also provide 1-hour webinars on very specific subjects. So over the next few weeks, we do have, a 1-hour training that's focused exclusively on E&E circumstances, really digs a little bit deeper. We have another one that's a general overview that's a little bit more in depth than what we were able to provide today. So definitely take a look at those resources. And I did see that Chris was able to pop those into the chat once again. So definitely take advantage of those as y'all continue with your response and recovery efforts. We are definitely here to help. So next slide. If you do have any additional questions, you can definitely reach out to your point of contacts at the state or your regional office, but you can also reach out to us using that FEMA-grants-news. We're pretty quick on the turnaround if you have any questions, and please let us know if we can help in any way. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and kick it back to you, Thomas. I don't think we have anything else.
Thank you so much, Flora. That was a lot of great information, and we always appreciate the PDAT team coming out and helping us out. Like Flora just said, we are here to help. As you've probably experienced during this briefing, this is a very large and sometimes complex program, but there are a lot of options here to assist you to navigate through it. You heard from earlier, Bob Barker, our PA branch manager. Shonda Corbett is also the Western branch supervisor where this disaster occurred. I did briefly, before we move further, just wanted to retouch on some of the debris information that Bob gave us when he was speaking about the options for local governments for debris. There are 4 options for an entity for debris removal. You have your force account labor in-house debris removal. You have your locally procured contracts. You do have the state debris contract available to you, as well as the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It's up to you as a local entity as what you want to do and what is the best option for you. Additionally, there is that MOU with the NC Department of Transportation and the local governments for any debris removal needed on an NCDOT owned road. Janine said she will be sending out more information after the briefing, so please keep an eye out for that. For your individual grants managers within the areas, we've listed all of the counties here, but Adam Lawrence has areas 11 and 12. Andy Andrews is in area 13. Shonda Corbett, again, is in area 14. And Namwin is in area 15. So please reach out to them if your entity is in one of these counties, and they will be able to assist you directly with any information or point you in the right direction and get you the assistance that you need. For any questions at large, we do have the PA hotline available for you at pahotline@ncdps.gov. This is consistently monitored and we'll be back with you as soon as we can. Likewise, for any grants portal technical assistance, since that is not a state system, we encourage you to please call the number here or reach out to FEMA-recovery-PA-grants@fema.dhs.gov for any technical problems with the system. With that, that is the conclusion of the briefing, and we are ready to field any questions. So if you have questions, please ensure you're putting them in the chat. I've seen we've answered the the majority, if not all, that have already come through. So thank you for Janine for doing that as we've been moving. But if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll address them as a group. So the PA grants managers are not going to be writing the project worksheets for the applicants. That is something that FEMA and their program delivery managers or PEDMGs will do in grants portal. The grants managers will play an active role in helping them do that, but the NCEM grants managers will not be writing the project worksheets. Mary, the clock for RPAs is to be determined just because the disaster event is still technically ongoing. As we get a firm conclusion date to the disaster period, that will be pushed out. So please monitor our website as well as just contact your grants managers for that. But it will be 30 days from the end of the event.
You can go on ahead and submit an RPA. Those are available in grants portal. And the slides will be available hopefully within the next day or so.
Yeah, and Norma, we can probably send a copy directly to the SOG. I do not know, Kevin, if mutual aid will be doing a separate webinar for entities submitting their mission reimbursement workbooks underneath the state mutual aid agreement. However, I would just encourage you to reach out to your contact there and see if that is something they are doing. We can look into it and get back with you. Kelly, yes, for debris removal, regular and overtime is available for force account. Yes, Tijuana, version 4 of the Papa G is still the most current version being used for this disaster, and version 5 is in draft, but since it is not published, barring any exception made by FEMA, no, it will be version 4 that will govern this disaster. Were there any other questions? Well, if not, as mentioned earlier, the slides will be posted as well as a recording on the public assistance website. Please feel free to reach out to your grants managers or anybody from this briefing, and we'll be happy to assist you in any way we can. Janine and I will stay on in case any questions come in late, but otherwise, that is the ending of the briefing, and we appreciate everyone's time. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.
Did anybody that was remaining have any questions? Doesn't look like it, so I will stop the recording. And again, appreciate everyone's time. Everyone have a great day, and this will conclude the applicant briefing. Thank you.
Thank you.